The Everett family spared no expense regarding their New Year's Eve gala. It was a scene of pure indulgence. Crystal chandeliers, golden candelabras, and a large ballroom that seemed to echo with the ghosts of 1,000 past celebrations. Guests drank, danced, and read about the centerpiece of the evening, a peculiar antique mirror that dominated one wall of the ballroom. The mirror had a presence of its own. Its gilded frame was adorned with carvings of vines and faces so detailed they seemed to watch the room. Guests swore they could see the glass ripple, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a pebble, but no one dared to speak of it aloud. After all, it was just a mirror, wasn't it? At first, the partygoers dismissed the oddities as tricks of the light or the effects of too much champagne, but here and there, subtle inconsistencies began to emerge. A woman's reflection adjusted her necklace moments before she did. A waiter's tray appeared empty in the glass, but full in his hands. The guests brushed it off with nervous laughter, determined not to let a mere mirror spoil the revelry. The mirror was impossible to ignore. It was as though it demanded attention, drawing the eyes of everyone in the room, even if only for a fleeting moment. A quiet unease settled over the party, buried beneath layers of laughter and music. Midnight was still hours away, but the mirror was already awake. Liam was the kind of guest who relished the spotlight. A quick wit, a dazzling smile, and confidence that drew people to him. But tonight, something about the mirror made his smile falter. Standing before it, he admired his reflection, as one might at any elegant gathering. Yet the longer he looked, the more wrong it felt. It was subtle at first. His reflection lagged, moving just a breath behind him. The smile staring back was wider, revealing too many teeth. Liam brushed it off, convincing himself it was the champagne, or perhaps the strange lighting in the ballroom. But then he noticed the shadows. In the mirror's glass, shadows danced between the guests, figures that didn't exist in the real world. One stopped and stared at Liam, its glowing white eyes locked onto his reflection. A chill ran down his spine, and he turned to look behind him, but the room was as it should be. The shadows, the eyes, existed only in the mirror. The night carried on, but the energy in the room had shifted. Laughter had softened, conversations slowed, and a subtle unease had taken root. The mirror, once an overlooked decoration, now drew glances, whispers, and uneasy chuckles. Something about it just felt wrong. At first it was dismissed as a trick of the light, a shimmer in the glass, a faint distortion. But then they began to see things, reflections of people who weren't there. A hand pressing against the inside of the glass, and faint, almost imperceptible whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. A brave, or perhaps foolish, woman stepped closer, determined to prove the mirror was nothing more than an antique. She adjusted her hair, her reflection mimicking her every move. But as she stepped away, her reflection's hand lingered on the glass for just a moment longer, as though reluctant to let her go. The whispers grew louder, an unintelligible chorus that filled the air. Guests turned to each other with nervous smiles, asking, "Did you hear that?" But no one could explain where the sound came from. The shadows, once confined to the edges of the room, began to move, creeping toward the center like liquid darkness. By now, the mirror was impossible to ignore. Its surface rippled like water in a storm, and within the glass, figures began to take shape. Shadowy forms with glowing eyes and crooked smiles stared out at the party. They didn't move, but they were watching. A young couple stood near the mirror, whispering nervously. They didn't notice the shadows in the glass growing clearer, more defined. One raised its hand, long fingers reaching toward their reflections. The room seemed to grow colder, and the whispers turned into faint, mocking laughter. An older man, trembling, dared to look into the mirror for too long. His reflection didn't mimic his fear. It smiled, cruel and knowing. And as he watched, it raised a finger to its lips, as if to silence him, before disappearing entirely, leaving only his wide-eyed face staring back. The room fell silent, save for the ticking of the clock. The whispers stopped, the shadows froze, and the mirror's surface returned to its deceptive calm. But everyone could feel it. The mirror wasn't finished. Midnight was still to come. The air grew heavier as midnight approached, the ticking of the grandfather clock louder than it had ever seemed before. Guests instinctively moved closer together, whispering nervously, their once boisterous energy now subdued. The mirror loomed in their periphery, an undeniable presence. But despite the growing unease, the host remained composed, perhaps too composed. Edward Everett, the evening's host, was a man unshaken by superstition. To him, the mirror was a mere artifact, an ornament of wealth and taste. As he raised his glass, he smiled warmly at his guests, blissfully unaware that his reflection was different. The guests raised their glasses in hesitant unison, their eyes darting between Edward and the mirror. A few swore they saw shadows moving within the glass, but the room's dim light and flickering chandelier gave them enough reason to dismiss it, though not entirely. Not everyone could ignore the mirror's tricks. A woman near the glass froze as her reflection tilted its head, its unblinking eyes locking onto hers. She stumbled back, spilling her drink, but her reflection didn't move, not at first. With each passing second, the whispers returned, growing louder and more insistent. They were no longer faint suggestions. They were voices, overlapping, echoing, and chilling the air. The room itself seemed to react, the temperature dropping until breath hung in the air like mist. Guests exchanged uneasy glances, their previous confidence unraveling. The whispers grew into a dissonant symphony that made it impossible to tell where one voice ended and another began. The mirror's surface came alive, its faint glow pulsating in rhythm with the whispers. Shadows within the glass were no longer subtle, they were unmistakable. They stood among the reflections, their glowing eyes unblinking as they watched the guests. Some mimicked their movements perfectly, while others stood motionless like voyeurs, savoring the fear in the room. The mirror had become more than a decorative piece. It was a living entity, feeding on the growing unease. And as midnight crept closer, it became clear it wasn't finished yet. When the clock struck midnight, the room erupted into chaos. The chime rang out, louder and longer than it should have, reverberating through the air like a distorted scream. The mirror's surface rippled violently, its glow intensifying, casting the entire ballroom in a pale, otherworldly light. And then, it happened. The mirror shattered, but not into glass. Shards of light burst from its surface, each fragment reflecting a distorted version of the room. Shadows that had lurked within the mirror were now free, spilling into the ballroom with grotesque grins and glowing eyes. When the clock struck midnight, the room erupted into chaos. The chime rang out, louder and longer than it should have, reverberating through the air like a distorted scream. The mirror's surface rippled violently, its glow intensifying, casting the entire ballroom in a pale, otherworldly light. And then, it happened. The mirror shattered, but not into glass. Shards of light burst from its surface, each fragment reflecting a distorted version of the room. Shadows that had lurked within the mirror were now free, spilling into the ballroom with grotesque grins and glowing eyes. One man, braver than most, grabbed a chair and swung at his doppelganger. The wood shattered on impact, splintering across the floor, but the reflection didn't even flinch. It tilted its head, mocking him, its glowing eyes narrowing as it stepped closer. A woman screamed as her doppelganger dragged her back toward the mirror. She clawed at the floor, desperate to escape, but the reflection's grip was unrelenting. The glass rippled as she was pulled through, her terrified face now pressed against the inside, her screams muffled and distant. Even Edward, the once confident host, was not spared. His reflection stepped out of the mirror, towering over him, its face twisted into a cruel sneer. It placed a hand on his shoulder, leaning close to whisper something that no one could hear. Whatever it said drained the color from Edward's face. The ballroom dissolved into chaos. Guests were dragged kicking and screaming into the mirror's depths, while others faced their reflections, paralyzed by fear. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, blending with the terrified cries. The mirror's glow intensified, pulsating like the heartbeat of something alive and hungry. And then it was over. The mirror stood whole again, its surface smooth and gleaming, as if nothing had happened. But within the glass, the party continued. The guests laughed and danced, their eyes hollow, their movements stiff and unnatural. The ballroom outside was empty, but the mirror was full. The mirror stood silent and still, its surface deceptively calm. Inside, the party continued, but not as it had before. The guests were there, yet they weren't. Their eyes glowed faintly, their faces stretched into hollow, lifeless grins. They stood motionless, their laughter and movements stiff, mechanical, like puppets dangling from invisible strings. One man raised his glass in a silent toast. Around him, others mirrored the motion, their movements synchronized, eerily perfect. But among the hollowed faces, one woman broke the pattern. She pounded against the glass, her hands bloodied, her screams faint and distant, like echoes from another world. At the center of it all was Edward. The once confident host now stood trapped, his face pale, his body trembling. His doppelganger loomed beside him, whispering secrets meant only for him. Whatever the reflection said broke him completely. His shoulders sagged, and his eyes grew as hollow as the others. In the real world, the ballroom was empty. The guests were gone. The only sound was the faint, persistent whispering that seemed to seep from the mirror. It stood there, an unassuming artifact, its surface gleaming with the reflections of a party no one could reach. From within the mirror, the guests turned. Slowly, deliberately, their glowing eyes fixed on the outside world. Their mouths stretched into unnatural grins as the whispers grew louder, filling the air with a single, unrelenting command. Join us. And then, silence. The mirror waited, patient and unyielding, its surface rippling like water under moonlight. The guests inside remained frozen, their hollow laughter forever trapped in a party that would never end. The ballroom outside was empty, but the mirror was far from it. It waited for its next invitation, its next victim,